Hey soldiers, did the Biden administration just give China a reason to invade Taiwan? We're in the opening stages of World War III, and the US just launched a devastating attack against China's economy. That's right, the Biden administration has basically paralyzed the Chinese semiconductor industry. Now look, the US is looking like it's taking steps to guard against retaliation from China. This has a big time economic component that you're going to need to understand so that you can position yourself accordingly. Ladies and gentlemen, it's looking more and more like we are pushing the boundaries and poking the bear and going from an economic war. This is a full-scale economic war to a hot war. I just regret having to even enunciate that. But it's looking more and more possible now. And the reason for that is because recently President Biden came out and he enacted some pretty extensive export bans. Let's get into it. The Biden administration's sweeping new export controls aimed at cutting off China from obtaining chips used in supercomputers has caused the, quote, complete collapse, unquote, of the communist country's semiconductor industry. And that's according to one expert. This is what annihilation looks like. China's semiconductor manufacturing industry was reduced to zero overnight. Lindag, CEO of Hedgehog Lab, said in a Twitter thread. Hedgehog Lab is a global digital consultancy. Basically, they keep their eye on that industry. Rules announced by the U.S. Department of Commerce last week restricting U.S. persons from involvement in manufacturing chips in China had led to a mass resignation of American executives from Chinese firms. And they're taking their institutional knowledge with them. That's why this is paralyzing that industry. Lidek of the consultancy Hedgehog said this has had the effect of, quote, paralyzing Chinese manufacturing overnight. Chinese manufacturing, of course, in the semiconductor, the all-important semiconductor industry. We wouldn't be having this conversation right now if it weren't for semiconductors. Running this camera technology, the editing software, the ability to get this message out over a broadband connection to all of you subscribers all over the world. And if you haven't subscribed, go ahead and hit that right now. All right, so this is what's happening. Complete collapse. And this guy, I don't know if he's engaging in hyperbole or not, but he goes on to say that they don't have any chance of survival. The Chinese semiconductor industry, the homegrown industry over there in mainland China. The rules, which came into effect October 12th, would bring severe damage to Chinese national security as a whole. You see where this is going, right? This is nothing like the 10 plus rounds of performative sanctioning during the Trump years. This is a serious act of industry-wide decapitation. He is using some really hyperbolic language here. If we reduce it by half, it's still it sounds pretty devastating. But China has an alternative. They have something that they can do. We'll get to that in a second. The U.S. Commerce Department said in a statement announcing the new controls that they were in response to China using supercomputers and semiconductors to create weapons of mass destruction and commit human rights abuses. So here we go again. The United States loves to talk about human rights abuses. Look, if you want to see some human rights abuses, and I abhor human rights violations anywhere in the world, but look into American prisons. You'll find some human rights violations going on right now for people who have done things like, I don't know, smoked marijuana. And I know that the president has made some overtures that some of these people are going to be let out. But if you spent a year in prison, the damage is done. You want to talk about human rights violations, the U.S. is certainly not exempt. And we're also talking about these weapons of mass destruction. We went over that in a previous video and talked about how, you know, that's kind of a mantra we use when we want to go out and have an excuse to make change around the world. So I'm not going to trust the U.S. government at face value. Maybe this is a situation, maybe it's not. But I certainly have lived on this earth and in this country and heard messaging from this government enough to know that I'm just not going to jump on the bandwagon right away, if ever. Quote, the threat environment is always changing, and we are updating our policies today to make sure we're addressing the challenges posed by China, while we continue to our outreach and coordination with allies and partners. This is coming from the Undersecretary of Commerce for Industry and Security, Alan Estevez. Semiconductors are used in everything from cars to refrigerators and are increasingly important in artificial intelligence and advanced military programs. Now, China is sitting right across the strait, right across the waterway from Taiwan. You know, Taiwan's responsible for 90%, okay, a whopping 90% of the manufacturing capacity of semiconductors globally. Now, if ever, I'm no military strategist, but I know that if I am now going to be short a resource, this guy at Hedgehog is talking about this is a decapitation of the semiconductor industry in mainland China. And we've got this, territory, country, whatever you want to call it, Taiwan, sitting right across the strait that is, far and away the most important landmass dealing with the semiconductor issue on Earth. This could have the effect of serving as more of a catalyst for China to go ahead and invade. Now, other countries are looking at this as well, and they're noticing that the United States has become extremely comfortable with all types of economic warfare. If you were the leader of a country and you're seeing this go on and you hold dollar reserves and you are, pretty dependent on America for all sorts of things, defense, you name it, food, aren't you feeling like maybe you want to make some additional friends and maybe want to come away from just being so dependent on, one major player? Look, Germany's finding this out. Their reliance on Russia has put them in sort of a pickle dealing with their energy supplies, right? So I believe that if some guy on YouTube, on a little YouTube channel, can say, hey, I think these countries are probably going to want to start to diversify in every aspect possible, I'm sure that all of the people surrounding these leaders in these countries are probably thinking the same thing. And the U.S. knows this. And herein lies an opportunity for us. Now, recently, there was a bill introduced in Congress that would put the United States financial system back on the gold standard. Representative Alex Mooney, he's a Republican from West Virginia, introduced H.R. 9157, titled the Gold Standard Restoration Act. And that legislation would peg the dollar to a fixed weight of gold. Now remember, other countries are talking about this, okay? So that is, not the best news for our reserve currency, because right now we have pretty much a blank check. That wouldn't be the case if it were tied to gold, but it may be the only thing that can save the dollar. Remember, the dollar, that is, was pegged to gold back before President Nixon temporarily took us off in 1971, 51 years ago, okay? The gold standard would protect against Washington's irresponsible spending habits and the creation of money out of thin air. This is according to Representative Mooney. Prices would be shaped by economics rather than the instincts of bureaucrats. No longer would our economy be at the mercy of the Federal Reserve and reckless Washington spenders. And that is why, at least in this Congress controlled by Democrats, that ain't happening, okay? But it's important that he brought it up. Now, what the powers in control are wanting to establish is a central bank digital currency. And we've talked about this ad nauseum. It's bad news for your economic freedom. One of the things you have to be aware of is that a lot of the talk that's centered around the central bank digital currency is having it held at the Federal Reserve, not in your private bank. And this would give the United States an all-new dimension of power and control over your daily life like you've never seen before. Bank of America back in January said that U.S. central bank digital currency would preserve the dollar's status as the world reserve currency. They didn't make it exactly clear how that would happen in this statement. But understand that Bank of America, the big banks they're a part of the Federal Reserve. So when Bank of America makes a statement like this, it's self-serving. It has nothing to do with caring about you, the depositor. We've talked about banks ad nauseum and at great length, and about how they're really great if you need to take a loan. But in terms of depositing money in banks and holding money in banks, that's becoming less of an attractive prospect, especially when you see what happened with Kanye West. There was a notable social media personality, and forgive me, I forget his name. I'll put it up on screen. These people have been excommunicated from their financial relationships with certain banks. PayPal and the shenanigans that they just pulled, saying that they were going to fine you if you said the wrong thing. So we are seeing that, there is a predilection to control you via your money, the money you're making, okay? There's a predilection by the U.S. government and large corporations to control every aspect of your life, starting with what you say. Do you really think that if they tell you to eat bugs instead of a steak, and you go out and try to buy a steak, do you think they're going to let you do that if you are, if you're spending a CBDC or central bank digital currency? That UPC symbol tells the computer exactly what it is you're buying. Beefsteak? No. Crickets? Yes. A U.S. central bank digital currency would differ from the digital money currently available to the public because it would be a liability of the U.S. Federal Reserve, not a commercial bank. So you would have no credit or liquidity risk, Bank of America said in a report. Okay, so they're actually advocating for this. Preserving the dollar status as the world's reserve currency, improving cross-border payments, and increasing financial inclusion, all the buzzwords, are all seen as benefits of a U.S. digital currency. Analysts led by Alkesh Shah wrote in a note back in January. The Fed published a discussion paper also back in January on the benefits and risk of a U.S. central bank digital currency. Potential risk could include, they could be diminished rather by CBDC design choices, including, quote, changing the financial sector's market structure by shifting deposits to the central bank instead of your bank of choice, instead of your private bank of choice, increasing the liquidity risk of the financial system if deposits at commercial banks were converted to a CBDC, and decreasing the efficacy of monetary policy implementation. What they mean by that is they could come in and say, okay, we don't need to raise interest rates, because if we do that, remember, with each interest rate hike, the interest on the national debt goes up. It becomes more expensive for corporations to borrow, okay? So they could actually, with a CBDC, separate corporations and the government and all of the heartache they would feel at an interest rate hike and put that totally on you by saying, we'll just throttle or restrict the amount of money you're able to spend at any given time. Don't believe me? Saul Amrova, she mentioned this several times. She's written extensively about it. And she was the nominee, Biden's nominee for comptroller of the currency. And she mentioned this years ago. So they already knew that going in. They wanted to telegraph this policy initiative. She didn't get nominated, but they still telegraphed that policy initiative. Okay, so that's how it's going to play out, people. Another interesting aspect of this is the Bank of England asserted that a UK-based central bank digital currency would act as a form of digital cash. Bank of America has some issues with that, of course, because they are a part of the central bank here, the Federal Reserve Bank in America. They said, them being Bank of America, CBDCs are likely to replace checking accounts as the way in which consumers hold the majority of their funds. So they differentiated and gone a step further and said, no, this isn't just going to replace cash. This is going to replace every aspect of how you deal as an individual citizen with your money. Britain, get on the same page with us. And they'll probably call they being the Federal Reserve here in America, probably call up the Bank of International Settlements, which has policy purview over all of these central banks and makes broad suggestions to them all. They'll probably call them and say, hey, look, the UK is not playing ball. Get them on the same page, and that will be done in short order. Guys, these are interesting times. You need to prepare accordingly. Look at these situations. Now, as far as gold becoming the backer of the dollar, again, I don't know if it's going to happen ever. But I tell you what, gold is a stable form of money. So you do with that what you will. You have to study these issues based on your specific situation. All right, soldiers, watch this video. 7 signs that the economy is being systematically and purposefully destroyed. This is a plan. You've got to understand these things, because if you don't, you're going to find yourself in an impossible economic situation where you're basically nothing more than a serf, an indentured servant. But you can take control and you can hold on to your economic independence. Guys, I'll talk to you soon.